This is how you start your weekend.
We need a nice disco track under that.
You know, yeah, right?
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Morbid.
You have the turntables there. Do it.
Yeah, I need to go to DJ school to learn how to make this work.
Yes. Our guest host today is business journalist Ramanyang. Do you still
Say it, please.
Say it.
Please. Please say it.
I've gotten into so much trouble for that.
Right.
Yeah, what time is it? 7 minutes past 8. You're tuned into Kenya's biggest conversation. My name is Ramanyang.
There you go. City, do the same with the proverb.
We are tuned into the 8 o'clock show, the best show in East and Central Africa, and I am City Muga. Wacha. Rama, I'm going to follow your script, my friend. I'm going to sound good the way you sound good.
In a few years' time,
Give me around 4 years, I'll get there.
bas.
When I'm mature.
Kabisa. What's today's proverb?
Yes, you cannot feed your donkey only when you need to ride it.
You cannot feed your donkey only when you need to ride it.
Yes.
Okay. If you say so, it's fine. Maybe we'll find a way of contextualizing that proverb with the conversation that we want to have now, which is about the Finance Bill 2022. Remember, the budget for the next financial year, 2022-2023, was presented before Parliament. The Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury went to Parliament and he said, this is what I'd like to do, how I'd like to spend money in the next financial year. These are the areas that will receive X kind of money. These are the kind of tax measures that I want us to have in the next financial year. And then they presented a finance bill to Parliament, which is now to be discussed and debated by members of Parliament, who will maybe amend and then pass it. Rama, what are the highlights of this finance bill? What are the key things that the government wants to do so that they can finance the next budget? 3 point what now trillion?
3.3 trillion Kenyan shillings. That's essentially what they need to, or rather they plan to spend for the fiscal year that's starting in July. The executive is going to be taking up roughly 60% of that expenditure. Roughly 26% of that goes into what is very innocuously known as consolidated fund services. So that's basically salaries, pensions, but most importantly, debt. And actually, we have almost a 14% rise in that. And in order to pay for that, some of the key underlying assumptions that the finance ministry had, or rather they were making, was that they're going to be able to raise at least 1.7 trillion Kenyan shillings in tax revenue. So that's a mix of everything from income taxes, pay-as-you-earn, corporate income taxes, VAT, excise, the lot. But some of the forecasts that they had there were a bit questionable. So, for instance, Treasury was forecasting a 21% increase in income taxes that they would be able to raise in the next fiscal year. Now, given everything we've discussed, job losses from COVID, we had at least 2 million people, give or take, who had lost their jobs. We've seen 2 straight years of negative income growth, 2020, 2021. In that sort of environment, how do you expect income taxes to rise by 21%? Right? That's simply not going to happen. They're expecting to have a deficit of around 6%. So the deficit is simply the gap between what you're spending and what you're able to raise through taxes. But historically, they've been able to essentially keep the deficit at around 8%. In fact, they've been running it at 8%, which is really, really high. Fiscal year 19, 20, and 2021, 2022, the one we're in now, it's also around 8.2%. So it stands to reason that the amount of money we'll end up borrowing is actually a lot more. So on the financing side, what we saw in the finance bill is a process of just raising more taxes. It's easy to ask what taxes were raised and which ones were not. And it's hit a whole variety of things. It's hit things from oil prices, it's hit flour, it's hit the food that we would like to have. And that's deeply problematic. There are a couple of changes that, of course, have been proposed by various parties. And I'm sure we're going to be getting some of the specific changes from Nikhil Hira in a bit.
So, but what are the areas? What new taxes or what new areas of tax? Already we are paying tax for. What else?
Actually, the question
This hand is full. So so how many How many more fingers from Undu's hand?
Actually, what else
Squeeze
is
more.
what else is there that hasn't been taxed that can be taxed?
Realistically, not much. Not much. If you talk to Treasury, if you talk to KRA, the argument from them is always, there are people who are still not complying with taxes. But you've got to ask at some point, where's the pain point, right? Because ultimately, there's a concept you'll hear about in economic circles called the Laffer curve. And the easiest way of explaining that is to simply say, what's the highest amount of taxes you can extract from an economy before that tax collection starts to fall off, right? How many feathers can you pluck out of the goose or the chicken before the chicken says, you know what, I'm not having this anymore. I'm scratching you and pecking the living daylights out of you. That's the basic idea. And in our case, if you look at taxes as a percentage of GDP, that trend has been declining for several years now. So arguably, all these measures that KRA and the Treasury have been implementing for the last 3, 4, 5 years have essentially hit their peak. Because if we're in a situation where we would say, you know, these tax measures are going up, and what they point to often is, yeah, but we collected 1.6 trillion shillings in taxes the previous year. That's higher than the previous year by X amount and higher than the previous year by X amount. Yeah, you are. But as a percentage of the total output of the economy, you're not actually doing that well.
Are we to believe the information that we read from time to time that KRA has superseded the expected target during a certain season and during a certain period? I mean,
this is where numeracy is an important thing, and Kenyans need to be aware of this. If you look at the targets that usually come out for taxes at the start of the fiscal year, they tend to be revised downwards as the fiscal year goes by. So by the time KRA is saying we hit our target or we exceeded it by X amount of money, more often than not, if you compare that to the original target that was set at the start of the year, it's a completely different story. They missed that target. But even then, that target in the first place is completely out of line with economic reality, which is, to go back to the example I gave you earlier, it does not make sense for you to be simply forecasting that you're going to be able to raise 21% more in income taxes in an environment where inflation is at 6%, heading up to 7%, where incomes have been declining for 2 consecutive years, where the private sector is barely able to invest, in part because lending is not essentially picking up, and 2, even dollar access is a problem. There's a lot of things in this puzzle that just do not make sense.
Let's see if we can bring in Nikhil Hira, who is a partner with Kody Africa LLP. Nikhil, if you can hear us, good morning.
Good morning. Good to be on board.
Thank you very much for joining us in this conversation today. This is the Situation Room, Kenya's biggest conversation. We, of course, you've heard the introduction that we've been having on this finance bill. The measures that the Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury has brought to Parliament, saying this is how I'd like to raise the money in the next to finance the next budget. What are the key areas that, let's not even go into the key areas, let's go into the main points of concern for many people such as yourself who have looked at this finance bill and the proposals?
So before that, I think let's just try and put this into context a little bit. What we've got here is that we went through COVID, 2 years of COVID, which was a problem.
Nikhil, are you there?
And yes, am I there? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah, okay. So 2021, things changed. We saw big growth, bearing in mind that we came from a negative base. And as we went through, at the end of the year, Yatani said 7.5% growth in 2021. Even the IMF said their numbers were about 7.2. So we did grow last year. We did collect taxes. We were exceeding targets. I take on board what Rama said about whether the targets were being flexed as we went along. But the first 7-8 months of the year, KRA actually exceeded target. Then we have high debt, and I know you were talking about this earlier. Nothing wrong with debt as long as you use it for the right purposes. And of course, that means not using it for wastage and other illicit funding of things and what have you. So if we controlled that, then the tax revenue we're collecting is fine. And Rama also mentioned that our tax to GDP is falling, and indeed it is. In the 90s, most of you were probably still not born or in school, but I remember 24% tax to GDP ratio, which was pretty good, and we're now down at 14, which is a problem. Of course, bear in mind this is just a ratio. So if the bottom, the denominator is increasing, then the whole thing will change anyway. So what this finance bill was trying to do was to bridge the financing gap. And they've done this primarily by looking at excise duty, and just about everything, any good that is subject to excise duty has been increased by 10% or proposed to be increased by 10%. They've brought wheat flour, maize flour, cassava flour into the standard rate of VAT of 16%. Last year we saw LPG and stuff going into VAT. And the issue, I think, for me is that, one, we're in an economy that's recovering. Two, the economy suddenly is taking a hit because of what's happening in Europe, Russia, Ukraine. We're not entirely out of COVID globally, although it's much improved. So where is this money going to come from? Are the taxpayer going to be in a position to do this, to pay for it? And I'm always concerned that when you raise taxes like excise duty, and you raise it by 10%, which is the proposal, and then in October you do an inflationary rise as well, although the commissioner has been given power to exempt things from inflationary rise. What happens is that people stop spending. They stop consuming. And so we had, if you think back a few years, there was a brand of beer that was meant for the lower market, doing very well in sales. Excise duty was increased significantly. What happened? People moved to the illicit brews. So not only did we lose the excise duty, we lost the VAT, we lost corporate tax, and we potentially lost PAYE because people got laid off.
Sure.
So to me, this increase in rates could end up being counterproductive. And the final elephant in the room really is that we have an election in August. And every time we have an election, we see a dip in growth, and then it takes sort of 6-9 months to come back up again. So 2022 not looking that hot.
Nikhil, I'm curious, or rather hard pressed to find the rationale or reasoning behind this. If taking all of these things that you've mentioned into consideration, then what would be the rationale between raising some of these taxes that we are talking about? If we have seen previous examples of how then people will hold on to the little shilling that they have left in a situation like this, why repeat the process knowing full well what people will do in this? I mean, just the example that you've given, not buy this beer, buy the cheap illicit brews, because you are not able to spend as you ordinarily would. Why repeat a process of which you've already seen the results in a previous time?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Look, the fact is that the things are just not balancing. The books are not balancing. So just think of your own budget at home. You bring in your income from your journalistic career, and you have expenditure. Could include a mortgage, school fees, food, etc., etc. Normal people would try and make sure that the income exceeds the expenditure. And okay, yes, you could borrow. You get a mortgage to buy a house or to finance a car or whatever. What we're doing as a government, though, is that we're deciding how much we want to spend, and then we're saying, now how do we finance it? So we come up, and the last 10 years, every time I've written about the budget and the Finance Bill and Finance Act, I've said, it's a bigger budget, it's a bigger budget. It's getting bigger and bigger, and of course it's reached 3.3 trillion this year, expenditure. So if we're only going to collect 1.7 trillion in revenues, then we have to find some other way to bridge the gap. So we're in this vicious cycle where debt is going up, tax revenues may not catch up, revenues are going down. So we're never getting out of that cycle. And we've also got to remember that we are getting assistance from major financial institutions around the world, the IMF, the World Bank, and they are putting conditions as well. We may or may not agree with what they're saying, but the fact is they're giving you money and they're saying, just like a bank giving you money for your mortgage, they're going to say, well, how are you going to pay it back? And that's exactly what the IMF and the World Bank are saying. You need to tax more. My own view on that, though, is in a country where poverty levels are 50, 70% of the population, when you start taking basic commodities and taxing them to death, how does it work? I mean, the poor get poorer. Even the middle class is struggling to buy certain things. So it's only the very top echelon, the 1%, I guess, of our market that's protected from these price rises and what have you that go with it.
I'd like to ask this question, if I may.
Yes.
What would happen if we determined to just live within our means, to simply live with what we collect, as opposed to the fairy tale amounts that we keep talking about, this 3.5 trillion in the budget? What would happen?
I think it'd be brilliant if we could do that. But I'm not a politician or a political analysis or whatever. We have to remember that since 2007, we've effectively been in a coalition government. We had the Grand Coalition post the post-election violence in 2008. If I remember right, there were 44 ministries as we tried to accommodate everyone in the coalition. We then had the 2013 elections, where again, although the standing party was Jubilee, it was a merger of two parties in a sense. So again, we're trying to keep both sides happy. And in a sense, even coming up this year with all these coalitions that we're forming, we're going to keep a whole load of people happy. So expenditure is just going to go up. And then, God bless our constitution. It was a very forward-thinking document. But does Kenya need 47 counties? The effect is that we've got 48 governments in the country, the center in 47 counties. And we have to pay for these people, the civil servants. So how are we actually going to live in our means? I mean, I think that would be the question to ask.
So we set ourselves up for this.
Yeah, I guess so.
But is it to the tune of 3.3 trillion shillings? Is it possible that we can actually run with a budget that is much lower than 3.3 trillion?
Well, don't forget, 3.3 trillion combines both our recurrent expenditure and our development expenditure.
Yeah.
Roughly 70, 75 recurrent, 20, 25, 30 is development. And included in that, of course, is the servicing of debt. And I heard in the earlier segment that you had on your show, we're borrowing in dollars. And when you borrow in dollars and the shilling crashes to 116 and might even crash further, don't forget when we come to repay, it's going to cost a lot more.
Yeah.
And we saw that with Eurobond 1. You remember, we took it in 2014. We were very proud, 6.25% interest rate, what have you. When we came to repay, the shilling had depreciated 25%. So it cost us 31 effectively. And I think that's the problem. And as I say, there's nothing wrong with borrowing. Just make sure that we use it for what it's supposed to be used, and not divert it to keeping our recurrent expenditure going.
There's one of the main things that's been a very defining hallmark of our relationship between the private sector on one hand and Treasury and Carey on the other has been it's been a very antagonistic relationship between these two parties. Mushai Kunyia, the chair of the Kenya Association of Manufacturers, mentioned a week ago that at some point you're going to need a Bill of Rights against our own tax agency because there's sort of powers that are being arrogated to it. are just growing completely out of proportion with the economic reality that a lot of businesses do face. Ideally, the draft national tax policy should be taking care of that, but it's not even come out yet, has it?
Absolutely. I mean, look, we've been waiting for it for a long, long time. If there's one thing I always criticize about Kenya's tax policy, is that it's become extremely short-term. So we're looking at something, oh gosh, books are not balancing right now, so let's bring in a new tax. And then next year you say, well, that actually didn't work, so let's take it out. Now, that means that there's no certainty in our tax system. And if you're an investor in the country, whether foreign or domestic, you want certainty in the tax regime. Most investors, whoever they are very willing to pay the tax as long as you make it certain. I mean, if you look at a list of what does an investor look at when he's actually top 10 things he'll consider, tax is probably 7, 8, 9, 10. Because people accept they have to pay tax, but they want it to be certain. You can't keep fluctuating every year, because then you can't plan from a business perspective as well. And then you've got to also think about, and this also has an impact on what KRA is doing in a sense. As the cost of business goes up, and it has, power bills are horrendously high with Russia, Ukraine, oil bills have gone up, and we all know what's happening at the the petrol stations. It's costing us a hell of a lot to fill our cars. And it is impacting everyone. And I will caveat that this thing about inflation, this is now a global problem. Yesterday, I was watching Biden speak about inflation in the US. It's spiraling there. It's spiraling in the UK. It's spiraling in Europe. India, it's going up everywhere around the world. And this is all a function of the geopolitics that's happening around the world. So we're all in this fix in a sense. And KRA is focusing on trying to get this revenue in. Yes, I agree that sometimes maybe they're a bit heavy-handed, but they certainly are doing a lot better than they were back in 95 when the KRA was formed. I mean, I've seen huge changes in how they approach things. The introduction of iTax, we may not like it, but the fact is that it's the way we have to go. KRA is using iTax to do data analytical review before they decide, Rama, you're not declaring enough taxes, right? So, and that's a good thing.
But ultimately, though, I mean, Nikhil, this whole process of just imposing excise tax on everything, because my understanding of how excise ideally should be working is that you impose it on things where, from an economic perspective, you're trying to retard consumption to some extent, right? So I'll impose excise, for instance, on fuel, because I know that, by burning hydrocarbons, there are all these negative externalities that kick in with air pollution, the health costs that come with that, etc. I'd impose excise tax on, beer, cigarettes, and so on and so forth, because of the health benefits, the health costs that come along with that.
Thank you, Rama.
Right, but here we are basically now expanding it to everything. Like there is no economic rationale to be imposing excise tax, for example, on food or airtime.
I totally agree with you. I think we're using excise tax all wrong. Yesterday on Twitter, someone said, is this a sin tax or a tax to just balance the budget? When I was growing up in the tax world, and I've been in it for almost 40 years now, excise tax was a sin tax. All those things we love to do, smoke, drink, carbonated drinks, sugar, all those things that affected our health were being taxed. And it was a measure designed to, as you said, Rama, to prevent that overconsumption of those things. What we have done over the years, though, this move to excise duty on bank processing fees, and every time you do you payroll and you pay PAYE to KRA, you get hit 350 shillings plus 20% excise duty. That's increasing the cost of business, and I think that's short-sighted in the way we're dealing with our economy. But excise tax was traditionally a sin tax, and it was on goods, not services. This extension to bank charges, M-Pesa charges, and so forth is, to me, counterproductive in the long run.
I think you're not getting the message here, Nikhil. The message from the government is that it's a sin to be Kenyan.
Okay, I won't. Well, yeah, you might be right. The whole thing is a sin at the end.
It's 27 minutes to 9. Let's take a quick break. We'll be back shortly after we take a look at the weather forecast. Nikhil Hira, weather and traffic. Nikhil Hira is a tax expert. He's a partner with Kody Africa.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.
Our guest host this morning, Ramanyang, and our guest for this hour, Nikhil Hira, tax partner, a tax expert and a partner with Kody Africa. We're talking about the Finance Bill 2022. It's before Parliament, proposals by the government on how they want to finance the next 3.3 trillion shillings for the next 1 year, starting July this year up to June next year. We're talking about excise duty. And much as it is, yes, and Nikhil, you're saying it's sin tax, but even look at the cost of this sin. In the last 10 years, for instance, the cost of beer, the recommended retail price for beer has more than doubled in just the last 10 years. That means that even if you're being told, all right, yeah, so this is a luxurious item, you've basically been told that you're going to pay twice as much in just a span of 10 years. Does that make sense, City?
You know, what I'm thinking of as you're speaking was the perfect example that were given by our guest of 75% of our expenditure this is recurrent. There are all these salaries to pay, and then there are these additional costs. Now, just speaking as a layman, surely, if that's where the bulk of our money goes, should this not be where we focus the trimming? This not be where we say, okay, folks, since you take the bulk of the money, how do we reduce the money that comes to you? Now, efforts that have been made in terms of talking about government reducing expenditure, that thing doesn't work. They say they've reduced travel. None of it's akin to what you call a Potemkin village, meaning a certain facade is created to give you the impression that something is happening, and nothing of that sort is happening. So even as we discuss and we keep talking about this, sometimes I actually feel helpless. I feel it's an exercise in futility because the government has no intentions of actually reducing what it knows it can reduce. None whatsoever. They'll talk about it, but nothing happens. There's no change.
And it's been over many years.
Yes, they talk about it, and the response to reduction is continuing with what they do and taxing us more. That's the response. It's like, you guys keep complaining. Here's another tax for you.
No. I'm actually going to reduce the number of shoes I buy next year.
Yes.
But
meanwhile,
so instead of 2, I'm going to reduce to 4.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, but ultimately the part of the problem, to your point, the fact is that what you tend to see with MPs in their decision-making process is that there will be tax hikes for thee and then benefits accruing to me. So last year, in fact, it's a conversation they've been having for a while now. They've been trying to essentially increase their ability to essentially get pensions paid by our money.
Yes.
Right? Okay, so you've left. You're a one-time MP. Yeah, we're going to give you a gratuity of X amount of money. And you're like, yeah, but look, if the rest of us have to essentially set up our own individual pension plans because NSSF really isn't working for the bulk of Kenyans. It really isn't working. The returns are subpar, for lack of a better word. If that is the situation that we're dealing with, why then should this collection of 300 plus people be able to essentially leech off taxpayers and say, no, I should get,
I've served you for
My
5
service
years.
to the nation should demand that you do 1, 2, 3.
Which service? When you're busy squeezing the cow until there's no milk in it, right? When you're busy raising taxes to a point where you're driving consumers away from a legitimate, safe product, to use the Kegbe example, into illicit products. You're endangering their health and their well-being. How is that useful? If you're going to make these sort of demands, I mean, they're not even tied to any sort of economic performance. If you're going to say, as an MP, I would like to acquire this specific pension at the end of 5 years, even if I'm a one-time legislator, fair enough. But where are your performance targets? right?
Yep.
What's your performance target on raising national income levels, right? What's your performance target on raising private sector incomes? What's your performance target on keeping inflation under control? What's your performance target on keeping debt and the deficit under control? None of those things happen. This is just for them, essentially, a free lunch.
It is.
And yet, what stops them from getting into a pension scheme like everybody else? So that it is your money that is deducted.
You contribute to it.
Yes, but it's yours. You're paid fairly well. I mean, this story of constituents wanting this, who forces you to become an MP? It's you who decides to become an MP. And you know the lay of the land. So why are you speaking as though you've suddenly come across something you didn't know? When you campaigned, you know what happens. You've seen what happens over time. Government,
I would agree with that.
is currently
I
constituted.
would.
Are you telling me that everything that the government spends on is absolutely necessary? The answer is no.
Nikhil.
No, I would agree with what's just been said. The fact is that I pay for my own pension, or did. I'm retired now, but I did. Right? No one funded me for it. Yes, I got an employer contribution. So we could be in this position where, as an MP, you set up your own scheme, or there's a parliamentary scheme or whatever. Maybe the government matches, fine, but these guys aren't paying anything towards it. And I saw in today's paper, I think that MPs are seeking a huge pay rise.
Yes, they are.
And that, to me, if we're saying performance based, then maybe that's not right.
So are we essentially saying that members of parliament, well, our parliament is also helping the government to not cut down on expenditure? Like, so when the finance minister comes and says, you know what, I've noticed that we have this kind of recurrent expenditure, I'm going to reduce on travel, I'm going to reduce on the things that we do, hospitality, flowers and all, I'm going to reduce this and the other. They don't do it, and because our members of parliament know where they can squeeze, they just allow them to do it as long as I get my this and the other.
I think it's a bigger problem than that. I think the whole setup that we have in terms of our recurrent expenditure and the fact that we're in coalitions means that we're never going to be able to reduce government expenditure. It will always climb. And until such time as we realize that, and we've heard it over the years, the successive finance ministers have said, austerity measures, we're not going to pay for this, we're not going to pay for that. We talk about corruption as well. Even the president said that we're losing 2 billion a day or something like that. But we're not doing anything about it. We've got to do something about it.
Well, okay, so Nikhil, if you were to just take a journey towards the ideal, here obviously we're living in a really negative reality. But if we were to take a trip into the ideal, because oftentimes what paints the picture for folks is to understand what the benefits would be of an ideal situation. So could you give examples of if this committee sat down, if the National Assembly sat down and said, look, this is what we ought to do in order to make this budget a reality, or even make the crazy decision to say we cannot operate within these lines that have been drawn, what would need to be done right now? What steps should be taken? And maybe if we saw that, then it would give people an alternate reality within which we ought to be operating.
Okay, so I think the first thing, and we spoke about this a little earlier, we need a long-term tax policy. We have got to move away from short-termism, where each year we're making change to the law, and then a year, 2 years later, we're saying, well, that didn't work, let's reverse it. Because that's just not the way that business can continue. And let's be very frank, our private sector in this country is extremely resilient. It's probably one of the most resilient on the continent, and our people are entrepreneurs. We want to work. It's not that we're standing there waiting for handouts. You'll even see people on the street at the traffic lights trying to sell you something.
Yep.
And you don't. Okay, forget where it may have come from, but the fact is that they're trying to sell it to you. Right? and they want to do that so they can feed their families, which is great. So let's have something that makes a government policy, both tax and expenditure and everything, that is long-term. I mean, we've stopped hearing about Vision 2030. When was the last time there was a big spread in the papers saying Vision 2030 is going to be the bee's knees for us? It's not there anymore because we're thinking very short-term. And that is an issue. And while we have coalition governments, that will always happen.
Nikhil, if I may just jump in briefly here, given your experience with tax policy in this country over the decades, what we've seen here over the decades, at least in the last 2 decades, has been a case of taxes just going up and up and up and up. But is there an example you can point to in our economic history? Because I believe we've done this before, where we've cut taxes in some way, and that has the resultant increase either in consumption or investment has essentially boosted the overall tax take that we've had accruing to Treasury.
Go back to the 90s. I know all of you weren't born there, I said earlier. But
well, not all of us.
Well, I certainly was.
Some of us have some significant carbon dating in our system. So,
yeah. So go back to the 90s. We were being taxed at a top rate of tax of 65%.
65%.
Yeah, and corporate. And in fact, there was even, if I remember right, an investment income surcharge. So if you had investment income, you were being taxed a further 17% on it or something.
And there was capital gains as well.
No, not in the 90s. It stopped in 85.
Right.
So we've had no capital gains from 85 to 2015.
Right.
Then we reduced rates down to 30% between 92 and 94, 95. Have a look at a chart of revenue growth, tax revenue growth in those years when we reduced. And you'll see almost a 45-degree upward line. The reason is it becomes cheaper to pay the tax than evade, get caught, pay the penalties and interest, and potentially spend some time in community prison.
So there is a business case here. There's a strong economic case, arguably, given the economic context we're in now. Inflation is surging. Fuel prices are going completely berserk. Food prices are nuts. And for most households, we spend roughly 30 to 60% of our income on food. There is a strong argument to be made for an across-the-board cut on personal income taxes and consumption taxes.
I believe so. Maybe it can't be a drastic cut because, of course, we do have to finance the country. But isn't that what we did in 2020?
And then we reversed it. We kept it for COVID. 7 or 8 months. And then at the end of December, literally at the third or the fourth week of December, said, no, we're lifting it back again.
Actually, my view on what we did in 2020, and I said this at the time, was that it was the wrong time to give a reduction in tax because people were losing jobs, businesses were closed. So, if I was losing jobs, I'm not paying pay as you earn. My companies are not paying corporate tax. VAT is going down. You reduce all these rates, who's benefiting? Because the market is not there.
Yeah.
And then I would have done it towards the end of 2020 and had it run through 21, 22.
So this would be the best time for such a stimulus kind of measure.
I think so. I think we do need some sort of stimulus. I don't think, unfortunately, the government has the money to do it. But I think if we did it, even if it's 5% reduction in rates or something like that, we could see long-term benefits. I think even Russia, some years ago, maybe it was in the early 2000s, they reduced their corporation tax by 1% or something. And over 3 years, corporation tax takings went up 14%. So, I think there's empirical evidence out there. It doesn't always work, of course, but there is empirical evidence that if you reduce tax rates, it means that people are more willing to pay the tax. As I said, 80%, 90% of our people or our investors are willing to pay tax. It's the price of living in a civilized society, but not being overtaxed. I mean, I think that's the problem. We're effectively being overtaxed.
Nikhil, I want to ask you a question because it's something I hear so often. I'm in need of a learned and informed response from someone like you. When we keep saying the government doesn't have money, what do we mean?
Well, I think what it really means is that we are bridging the gap by borrowing. So the funds may be there, but it's borrowed funds. And what has happened over the years, certainly over the last 8-10 years, is we've always had borrowings. All countries do have them. Over the last 8-10 years, the composition of our debt has changed. So where we had a lot of concessional loans, low interest, much better terms, we moved to a lot of commercial debt and in foreign currency. So as we said earlier, if the shilling as it is now is collapsing, it's going to cost us more to service that debt. I mean, the way I always look at this is I look at my own household and say, well, and again, we said this earlier, what do I earn? What can I spend?
Right.
And most people will do that. Yes, it's a problem in some ways. I mean, even if you look at online borrowing, I mean, there were some reports about Fuliza and things yesterday. It's huge how much money is being used that way. But that is a function of people struggling with high inflation, high prices, potentially lack of jobs as well, although there has been a slight uptick over the last 6-7 months. So we're in that catch-20. Does the government have money? Well, it doesn't have its own money. It's borrowing money. And then it's relying on tax revenue. And in a time when the economy is not doing brilliantly, tax revenue will not be where we want it to be.
What would...
I mean, I think we've got to give some kudos to KRA that in the first 7-8 months of this financial year, they've actually exceeded target.
I hear what you're saying, and then I'm also, I mean, we're listening to finance and budget committees sitting down and having these conversations over the last, couple of days and then into next week. And we're saying, look, what would stop government today from seeing these things which are plain and clear as day to everybody else and saying, this is the situation which we have. Why can't decisions be made along the lines of the situation that is present? Because if anything, what we are saying now is that we're just going to go back into what has happened over the last 20 years, as Rama has said. We're not making any decisions that are going to make things better. They may be a little bit difficult in the short term, but the long run would be benefit in terms of what will happen economically for the country. But it seems as though, the committees will sit and we'll just make the same decisions that were being made before, and we're not making any headway. If anything, we're running into headwinds.
I totally agree with you. We are, and we've been doing it, as Rama said, for the last 20 years. We're not sitting back and thinking, well, what is good for the country in the long run? And as our debt has increased and our need to service it has increased, our decision making has become poorer, to my mind.
One prime example
we
of
need to address
that, if I may just interject, Nikhil, would be with respect to our policies on, say, fuel, for example. I mean, this on paper looks like a prime opportunity to essentially use the tax code to try and shift more of our transportation onto electric vehicles, onto electric bikes, onto electric buses. But there's absolutely nothing that's coming through in this budget that suggests that, hey, you know what? Here's what we're going to try and do to change our consumption patterns. Because you do that at one stroke. If you have a big percentage of your fleet, or say 20% of your fleet of motorbikes, vehicles, buses, whatever, running on electrons instead of fossil fuels, that has an immediate impact on your foreign exchange because you're not importing as much oil. That has an immediate impact on air quality. You're not burning as much fossil fuels. But our legislators and Treasury just seem to be sitting back and saying, yeah, well, business as usual.
We shall catch up when we catch up.
Yeah, Rwanda is doing it. Rwanda has a number of schemes that are moving to all electric bodabodas. I think electric buses as well. And it makes sense from the whether we accept climate change or not. It does make sense to do this, cleaner air, etc., etc. But when we introduce something that says and we've got to do this phased. A few years ago, 2-3 years ago, we introduced excise duty or we reduced it on fully electric cars. And the question I had at the time was, great, this is a good idea, but how many people can afford a fully electric car? And where are we going to charge these cars? Because we don't have charging sites everywhere.
It's a chicken and egg question, isn't it? Because if you don't have, where do you start? Do you start by stimulating demand, or do you create conditions for that demand to exist?
Yeah, maybe you start by giving a break on hybrid cars first, and then move to the fully electric. So again, it's a question of saying, well, where do I want to reach, and what policy do I have to put in place to get there?
It's a journey to
and
get
I don't
there.
think we're doing that. Yeah.
Nikhil, one final question. Just going back to what we were discussing earlier, they're looking at the situation in Sri Lanka and saying, can we borrow lessons from there? Look at how Sri Lanka ended up where it got here. Debt deficit is an issue. The food prices was an issue. Of course, the global pressures in the supply chain, shocks on forex earnings from tourism, from everything else. In this country, what is it that would get us to a point such as where Sri Lanka is?
Look, Sri Lanka was doing very well, in a sense, till pre-COVID. Its entire tourism industry took a complete hit when COVID came along. We went through the same. It's picking up now. What is saving this country, though, is that we have a diaspora that is committed to us. We get more money every month in USD from the diaspora than we do from our exports.
Yep.
And without them, we could very well be in a Sri Lanka type situation.
Wow.
So, God bless the diaspora.
Indeed. Nikhil, thank you very much for speaking to us this morning. Nikhil Hira is a tax expert. He's a partner with Kody Africa. We've been talking about the finance bill. How is the government going to finance the next budget? And what are these things that they're going to do? They're going to tax leg. Now they're coming for their entire head.
Kidneys.
Liver, the internals, everything.
You'll be left with hair and teeth.
Only hair and teeth. They've taken the entire head.
Oh, well.
Yeah, I have no hair, though.
Join the club.